Hi, everybody. My name is Virginia Summy, and thank you for coming to another happy hour hosted by the Civil War documentary. Our guest tonight is Dr. Michael Dickinson, who is an assistant professor at Virginia Commonwealth University. He received his MA and PhD at the University of Delaware, and he is here tonight to talk about his new book, Almost Dead: Slavery and Social Rebirth in the Black Urban Atlantic, 1680 to 1807, which just came out this May from the University of Georgia Press. So we are excited to have him here. And with that, I will turn it over to Michael to talk about his book.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Thank you all for having me. If you haven't seen the cover of the book, I actually have a copy right here, and I'm a big fan of the cover, so I enjoy showing it off when I have a chance, though I did not design it. I like to highlight it. And so just to sort of get us in the mindset for the book and give us sort of a sense of some of the topics I'm trying to address in the book, I'm gonna actually give you a taste of the first two paragraphs, because I think that really sets the tone for the book, and hopefully that will give us time for a lot of question and answer, because I know I can be long-winded and I would like to make sure that you all have time to get your questions in. And so when we think about the book, before I go into this little piece of it, I want us to really think about the human story at the heart of slavery, and that's really the larger thrust of the project and the book itself. So at the age of 16, Berea Brinch, later known as Jeffrey Brace, lost everything, all but the memories of loved ones ripped from his grasp and recollections of a community an ocean away. He left his West African village as an untroubled adolescent. The Atlantic slave trade forcibly conscripted the son of Africa into manhood. To be aged by the lash of the whip and the sights of suffering was to reach maturity by a cruel path. On the slave ship, Brace's senses were overwhelmed with pleas for mercy, odors of excrement, sense of death, and visions of agony. In 1759, after months in a floating prison, Brace arrived in Bridgetown, Barbados, the second largest slave trading port city in 18th century British America. Brace's cries were merely a handful of countless tears in a flood, a stream of lamentations stemming from thousands of souls forced along the city's wharfs, crossing the threshold from Atlantic sojourn into urban captivity. Close to 40,000 enslaved Africans arrived in Barbados in the 1750s alone, mostly the island's premier port, Bridgetown. For those African captives not sold in West Indian markets, Caribbean ports were merely a degrading detour to a lengthier journey, ultimately reaching the ports of urban North America. Jeffrey Brace's story, like thousands of others, was an urban Atlantic story linking Anglo-Atlantic ports in a lived tapestry of suffering and survival spanning the African diaspora. It was in Bridgetown that traders inspected Brace and his shipmates like livestock, selling many to the highest bidder. It was in the Caribbean city that Brace endured commodification as merchants worked to systematically transform captives into commodities through brutality and deprivation. Starving, dehydrated, heartbroken, and sickly with innumerable physical and emotional wounds, Brace bemoaned to a fellow African, quote, "I'm almost dead." These words supply the title of the book, for Brace's words spoke volumes of a diasporic struggle to survive for people of African descent in the Black urban Atlantic. The statement spoke as much to a physical condition as to a social reality. His body was a vessel almost destroyed as he fought to keep his spirit on this earthly plane. Abduction and separation removed his tangible ties to the society he knew from birth. Nevertheless, he would survive. He would survive the days of horror. He would survive the nights of loneliness. He would survive the physical and psychological trauma of enslavement. However, that survival meant entering a world where free labor meant more than lives, toiling in an institution where survival meant more than human beings, struggling in a realm where Black bodies were dispensable objects to be expertly exploited and senselessly destroyed. Indeed, Brace was almost dead, and urban Atlantic slave communities would prove critical to his survival. His words, hardships, and resiliency would be echoed through the lives of numerous captives who found themselves within the urban Atlantic. And so really what I'm trying to do within this project is understand the human story. It starts in West Africa following Bryce, sure, but multiple figures and populations that are coming from West Africa and how they are starting communities in urban centers in the Caribbean and on the mainland during the long 18th century. And when I say human story, I'm really trying to get at how are these enslaved folks, how are they rebuilding these social ties that are fractured by forced separation? How are they dealing with the struggle to rebuild, right, communities when they are ripped from communities regularly, not only from West Africa but also between these communities? And how are they recreating traditions and their cultural landscape of West Africa in these urban centers through the long 18th century? And so hopefully it gives you some perspective on the larger sort of thrust of the book. Happy to answer any questions from here, because I think there are a lot of moving parts to it, but I like to emphasize the human element of this more than anything else.
That is an amazing opening. Very powerful. I know I'm sitting here jotting down questions that I have, but I will open it up first because I will not monopolize the discussion. Anybody else?
No pressure at all.
Yeah. Well, I'll go on. The first question I have, and I'm kind of reaching down into my African American Studies classes from grad school, and whenever I think about continuity between Africa and in the Americas in general, the whole Melville Hertzwitz argument.
Yeah.
And that was like immediately my first question was, where do what was the level of continuity that they were able to maintain in your research that you found?
Yeah, so really good question. I think so. One of the benefits, in part, this is a comparative study, right, between urban centers in the Caribbean on the mainland, and part of what that reveals is that there is extraordinary brilliance, let's say, in what Herskovits is saying. And what Herskovits essentially argues is he's arguing that there's a lot of continuity, right, between these Black communities in the Americas compared with that of West Africa, and he's highlighting this sort of through line, right? And the other side of that, we have E. Franklin Frazier and some other folks that sort of highlight that it's not the same, right? Or they highlight discontinuity and highlight that what becomes African American culture and Black culture throughout the diaspora of the Americas, it's extraordinarily different, right? So they're highlighting this difference. I think there's utility in both, right? And it's dependent on population demographics and how we understand, right, the size of these communities to the extent to which they're able to hold on to West African traditions. What does that look like based off of the Black population versus white population, right? And a good example of this, I say that because I actually have a chapter on some of these festival celebrations that happen on Sundays and holidays in urban centers in the Atlantic. And so a good comparison there, right, is Kingston, Jamaica versus Philadelphia, because they both have Black populations, right? They're both extraordinarily large urban centers, but the demographics are very different, right? Kingston is a majority Black city, right? Versus Philadelphia, which is majority white city, right? And so what we can see is that there are efforts in both populations to maintain these West African traditions. They get together, on Sundays and special days, they dance like their ancestors. They have these have these music performances that are very much linked to West Africa, but it looks different, right? It looks different, because they're in the Americas, right? Vincent Brown tells us this, because it's not the same, right? Something's lost in the Middle Passage, but it's also different if we look at Kingston versus Philadelphia on these two ends of the spectrum, because what they can maintain is very different, meaning that that there's more cultural homogeneity, right? Like in Philadelphia, necessarily so, right? They can't maintain the ethnic ties in the same way. So what they do is that they make these differences, or these differences based off of regions, for instance, right? Rather than particular ethnic groups that they can maintain in Kingston, based off of this large population with these very vibrant ethnic ties that they're able to have, right? And so I sort of spell it out so we can sort of see it, because we don't have visuals of this. But if we did, right, we would see this larger celebration. Equiano mentions this, right? He talks about Kingston and these large celebrations on Sundays, and he says, you know, they have they're organizing in groups, right? And essentially what that suggests is that they're grouping based off of where they're coming from in West Africa. And they're able to do that because there's so many enslaved folks in Kingston, right? Not so much in Philadelphia at the end of the spectrum, because there is a smaller population, so their celebrations look different, right? They're more together than separate, right? And so it's very much based off of a number of factors. And I think that comparative dynamics tells us that Herskovitz is right, but there are also some very real barriers to that based off of population demographics and a number of other factors. So that's a long answer to your question.
No. Yeah, no, and I was fudging the names a little bit there when I asked the question.
No, I'm very impressed.
But yeah, no, that totally makes sense, that the continuity would depend on the amount of, you know, people who are able to maintain traditions. Yeah, that totally makes sense. Right else.
Philip, was that a hand? I thought it was a hand.
Yeah, I guess I'm inviting you to speculate about the gaps in the recorded narrative. I know that's always both a danger, but in some ways it's part of trying to have a full perspective. For instance, in your dates, some of that includes periods where free Black middlemen could be allies of colonialism, or even sometimes double agents, triple agents and things. And I've read that there were probably more secret societies for various reasons than we sort of assume when we look back, because there were people with special skills, special interest groups, you know, sugar experts on specific crops. And I guess I'm wondering what you imagine was going on in that sort of vast underground.
That's a really big question, a really good question, right? Because I mean, you're right that there are a lot of things we just can't know, right? About what's going on sort of behind the scenes, in terms of, you know, these connections between people of African descent, right? In very real ways that belie, you know, what is in the sources. There's an interesting there's a really interesting point within Brace's narrative, right, where he meets this woman in Bridgetown, and he talks about her very fondly. She actually helps him out. He talks about her being his countrywoman, right, and it's fascinating because, you know, he doesn't necessarily have any direct connection to this woman, but he seems to see this linkage, right? And so how do we unpack what he's really saying there about how he sees his connection to this woman? Because it's not she's not from his village, right? And she may be from an ethnic group, but what do we see as those social ties, right? That undergird exactly this connection that he's saying. And we don't really know, right? And so that's an interesting space where I'm sort of, in the book, I'm sort of speculating what he's trying to tell us there about these community ties that that do not necessarily that aren't necessarily within our purview, right? Because I think you're right. I mean, Michael Gomez did a lot of this thinking about those secret societies in South Carolina, right? That are there in maybe in his book, maybe that was 15, 20 years ago, Exchanging Our Country Marks, if you're interested. He's looking at some of these secret societies, but it's easier to sort of look at that, I think, see that more on a plantation, right? In these large populations on plantation that is in cities. Cities are very difficult to really get at that because of the nature of work and labor and movement, right? So that's a really good question. I think there are a lot of spaces that it's worthwhile to, I think we can probe more deeply, that we might not necessarily see, really get at all the answers. But one of the ways to do that, I'll leave it here, is to really track back to West Africa and sort of look at these cultural ties and traditions and groupings that that these folks have in their native communities, help us understand what they're forming in the Americas and how there's also continuity there, right? And so, yeah. I think we should leave it there, but that's a really fascinating question.
Thanks, Philip. Kind of building on that, I'd like to kind of dive into your focus on the urban Atlantic.
Yeah.
Specifically, why the focus on urbanity instead of slavery on plantations, but how was slavery in urban environments important to your argument?
Yeah. So I'll give you two answers. One will be my historian professional answer. My other will be my personal answer. So the historian answer is that there is a gap in the historiography, right? And we think about, cultural preservation or cultural continuity, West African cultural continuity in urban centers, as well as, when we think about a comparative dynamic looking at these connections between Philadelphia or when we think about the Mid-Atlantic and we can go up to New England, sort of the North and the Caribbean, right? There's a gap there that I don't think historians have really thought deeply about. So many of these things, such as cultural continuity, right, they've been discussed a lot in terms of plantations, but we don't really think about that in terms of cities, and that's something that I really was fascinated with. My personal answer will be, so I actually grew up so I grew up in northern Delaware, which is essentially one big suburb of Philadelphia. And my family would go to church on Sundays in the city, and I've always been fascinated by cities. It's sort of this dynamic that I've always been really intrigued by, and I love comparative history. So I really wanted to understand. The more I learned about these connections between the Caribbean and Philadelphia, I was really fascinated by. And I wanted to probe at that more and understand, what do we know about these populations coming from the Caribbean, noting that, most of the enslaved folks that come to the Mid-Atlantic and to these cities in the North actually come from the Caribbean. And so what do we know about these populations? How do we understand what they're bringing with them? How do we understand those that are sent back to the Caribbean, right? And of course, as I started to incorporate more slave narratives, this started taking more of a human turn that I think is where I started to settle for the actual book. But I've always have a fascination with cities. I live in Richmond now, actually, so it's a personal fascination as well.
Nice, thank you. Oh, Ethan.
Yeah. So I was thinking, just kind of like, in writing this book, did people like Orlando Patterson, kind of like his concept of social death and slavery, and kind of, how like power dynamics and the kind of the physical distance of being kind of transported across the Atlantic and being socially and physically isolated from your homeland, from Africa, kind of like play into your concept of like social, with a title like Social Rebirth, like the continuity kind of that is transferred across the Atlantic, just kind of like how Patterson's work influenced your own.
Absolutely. And Ethan, it sounds like you already read the book, because you're precisely right. You're hitting the nail on the head, right? Patterson really functions on an ideological realm, right? So deeply into what I'm trying to do here. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with Patterson's argument, he essentially makes this argument about social death. And his concept of social death is essentially saying, right, through capture and forced migration, right, to the Americas, enslaved populations, enslaved individuals, he says they suffer what is akin to social death, meaning that them being ripped from their community and their families is essentially a death of sorts, because they're being ripped, but also they're not being integrated into anything, right? They go to the Americas and their kinship ties and community ties aren't being recognized by those in power, and they're not being incorporated into mainstream society, and so they sort of have this liminal space. He used the term of social death. And so I actually got the term social rebirth. I borrowed it from a brilliant scholar, Stephanie Smallwood. Her book Saltwater Slavery, she makes this argument saying that, Patterson gives us a useful point to highlight the impact of slavery and forced migration and this struggle, right? But it's only part of the story. And she mentioned, we should have a concept of a partial, at least, rebirth, right? And she sort of ends her discussion. She's really focused on the middle passage. She ends her discussion right when she gets to the Americas. And so what I wanted to try to understand is how can we comprehend this process of social rebirth in the lived realities of enslaved individuals and populations once they get to the Americas, once they get to these cities where they are sold, where in many ways there's a new portion of their life, right, that begins in the Americas. So how do we understand how they're rebuilding these communities? How do we understand how they're rebuilding these kinship ties? How do we understand how they are trying to continue what they remember from their cultures in these cities, right? And so I think Orlando Patterson does us a favor in trying to really think about the gravity of slavery, right? But I don't think that's the whole story, right? That's half the story, in my opinion. The other part is that they are rebuilding, right? They are exercising a level of resilience, and it's not as though they're seeing their lives as completely ending as a result of slavery. In many ways, they're making these conscious decisions to rebuild, to reconstitute, to survive.
So I have to be 100% honest. I have not read the entire book, but
no pressure.
But I am curious about Philadelphia is a city in the book, important city. What kind of comparison and contrast do you find between different cities in different places, particularly between the South and the Mid-Atlantic, and how that continuity was disrupted and able to continue at the same time?
Yeah. So Philadelphia is really important. I focus on Kingston, as I mentioned, Bridgetown. Some other cities are in there, but those are sort of the main cities I focus on because I'm looking at this sort of urban pathway. So I will flip your question and actually point out, because something I was fascinated by in really conducting the study was how many things are similar, right? Despite the fact we see these really, really important demographic distinctions. I don't want to minimize that, but I think our intention or our I don't know, our focus tends to be, our analysis tends to really say, at least within ourselves, I know my students say this, right, that if we think about Philadelphia, right, a northern mainland city versus the Caribbean, right, they'll say, well, it's probably easier to be enslaved in Philadelphia. I don't know if that's necessarily true, right? And so what I think is the continuity here, despite the cities that we're examining, is that force and fear are tenets of a slave system, right? They rely on force, fear, surveillance is a huge part of these systems. That we can think about the efforts of these enslaved individuals to maintain and form families and communities. That these cities, as much as they lend themselves to movement, they also have unique barriers to the hinterland or the plantations surrounding them, right? And so there's a lot of continuity there in ways that I don't think we think about, right? And part of the reason why I chose Philadelphia is because it's sort of seen as this hub of freedom and liberty during the period, right? But if we look at the slave system there, I mean, in many ways, there are many similarities to other slave systems in other cities throughout the Anglo-Atlantic, right? And that doesn't mean that Philadelphia doesn't necessarily earn its moniker as this hub of liberty, but I think it complicates things, at least in terms of seeing this through the eyes of those enslaved, right? Given what they're going through, the threats that they face, right? The struggles that they have, the resilience that they demonstrate, right? It looks very similar in many ways to enslaved individuals in other cities. And I think what we do see is a larger, again, these larger human elements of a system, rather than distinctions or differences that we oftentimes tend to assume.
So I've got a question about Philadelphia, since it's such a key city in your book. Do the Quakers make any difference there, or is this kind of a myth?
So they make a difference. We can say that they start off this early wave of abolitionism, right? I think scholars in recent years have sort of pulled back slightly about these on the Quakers, highlighting that they're helpful in the growth of abolitionism there, but they're not the end all be all, so to speak, right? We do see a lot of efforts by the free Black population there, right? We also see efforts by those sort of caught up. These are white Philadelphians, or predominantly Philadelphians, but also in Pennsylvania more generally, that during the Revolutionary era, they're caught up sort of in the revolutionary fervor, right? And the sort of the buzzwords, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, ideals, and so it's a number of things. But the Quakers are very early. There's actually a book by I think it's Marcus Rediker's John Woolman. He looks at this early abolitionist effort. Anthony Benezet, he's huge in this early period. So there are a few figures that are Quakers that are big before the Revolution in trying to push forward this abolitionist cause, but they're few and far between. Their aberrations. The Quakers get some credit, which I think they deserve in trying to, in Philadelphia at least, they break fellowship with members who refuse to get out of the slave trade and refuse to free their enslaved folks. So those are things that I think they're laudable and important. So they're important, let's say, but I think there are also larger processes at work. Again, the revolutionary ideology, efforts of free Black activism as well. And so a bunch of moving parts in Philadelphia that sort of make it so that it's this hub of liberty. Because if we think about the first abolition society, right, in North America, it's the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, right? First started by Quakers right before the Revolution, but it actually dissolves as a result of the Revolution. And it's mostly non-Quakers, white non-Quakers, that pick up the mantle and do a lot of work, right, in the 1780s, 90s, early 1800s, and trying to help.
Franklin, right?
Yeah, Franklin. He actually becomes the president later on, right, of the Abolition Society, right? And they try to use the courts to help enslaved and free Blacks to get their freedom during the period.
I love a good question about Quakers, because each in Greensboro, North Carolina, where there was a hub of the coffins, the Underground Railroad in that area. And one of my favorite quotes, every year I have Max Carter come, who is a Quaker historian, and he said once that Quakerism was kind of like tofu. It takes on the flavor of whatever it's around. And so,
that's a great quote.
Yeah, that's a good quote.
And so, yes, Quakers were abolitionists in Guilford County, and Guilford County had this, unionist reputation towards the war, but ... I always appreciate a good Quaker question. I'm not. Yeah. Oh, Philip, is that your hand?
Well, it wasn't until recently in some of the discussion about Mansfield Park and the funds that paid for the lifestyles, that I realized that I had no idea about Jamaica's untold story. So that means I have no idea about Kingston's untold story. And so I sort of imagine like a port and like ships with cargo. And I think what I imagine is much more like a depressed urban space that would be a victim of colonialism, when it seems to me the thing we don't talk about is that Kingston was like a heroic success story for reliable money generated by the enslaved, innovative British bank financed, etc., you know, really sort of industrial humanity and productivity. So I guess I'm wondering, like what kind of city was Kingston? You know, what was up with like Friday Night Kingston, if you see what I mean?
Well, you're right. Kingston was a vibrant city, right? I mean, it's a very large city. Philadelphia is very large as well. If we go to the period before the Revolution, right? They're almost around the same size. But the issue is with Kingston, or the difference is that Kingston has a majority and Black population, right? Because it's so reliant on slavery. It's really the hub of the British Empire in many ways in terms of its wealth, right? I mean, we are Americans. I think most of us are, at least, and we tend to really think about the American Revolution and the British were so hurt in losing the 13 colonies. They cared far more about the Caribbean, right, than they did about the 13 colonies, and it's because they were, you know, the money makers, right, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, and Kingston's really at the helm of that. It's the largest. Jamaica is the largest the largest sugar producing colony in the British Empire at the time, and Kingston is the largest port, right? And so it's a very vibrant city for various reasons, for commerce, sure. In terms of its slave market, of course, right? But there's a quote I use in the book about like the different names and languages, right, you hear in Kingston from West Africa. It's because of these large populations that are coming from West Africa in order to work in the city, and as well as on the plantations, right, the surroundings. And Kingston is this large, bustling marketplace in many ways. And it's really the space of wealth, right, for Jamaica, but also I think in many ways for the British Empire. And so you're right. I don't think we think about Kingston in that way, but I think we should, if given the historical accounts of Kingston. It's a really good point.
Interesting. So oh, Ethan, God. Ethan, you're still on mute.
Happens to the best of us.
The classic talking while on mute. Kind of just sparked what you just kind of said, kind of sparked a question for me, is say like Kingston being a majority Black city, and I'm assuming like Philadelphia was not.
No, not at all.
Do you see differences in kind of the experience of the enslaved in each city, kind of as in terms of maybe like people in Kingston having a little bit more autonomy, if you will, kind of being like a larger Black enslaved community there rather than say somewhere like Philadelphia?
Well, I think you're right in that if I were an enslaved person and I decide to run away, right? It's easier to blend in Kingston than it is in Philadelphia for the demographic regions that you mentioned. And so I think one of the things we don't think about, however, is the extent to which it's and this goes back to Ginny's question a while back, when we think about, you know, some of these differences between cities and sort of muddying the waters here, is if I'm an enslaved person and I want to hold on to my family, right? The slaveholding sizes in Philadelphia, because there's sort of a handful within a household, there's a higher likelihood that someone's children are going to be sold away, right? Or it's more difficult to hold on to your family, versus in Kingston, where the slaveholding sizes are larger. The chances of living in the same household as one's children or a spouse are far higher, right? And so that I think that's important, right? When we think about, you know, the extent to which these folks are losing family, certainly in West Africa, but also trying to rebuild, right, over generations, their family. But I mean, there's always the constant threat of them being sold away. And so slaveholding size matters, first being sold away, but also the extent to which, right, I could be able to see my children regularly or see my spouse regularly within the same household without having a permission from a slaveholder, right? And so so I think those things really matter for the lived experiences of these folks.
Sure. My question is more about the nature of slavery in urban centers. A lot of my research right now kind of focuses on, you know, how enslaved people built, you know, the infrastructure of the state of North Carolina, particularly, you know, railroads, the University of North Carolina, the Capitol, you know, all of these things. And a lot of, at least in the South, a lot of enslaved people who worked were rented or leased. How did that play out in the North? And can you speak a little bit to, sorry, I'm a North Carolinian, I think North. North. Can you speak to a little bit more about the nature of urban slavery in the Mid-Atlantic?
Yeah. So I mean, what you pointed out is a major difference, right? And we think about, for example, Philadelphia. Philadelphia has a higher rate of, or a higher proportion of enslaved labor than the countryside, right? That's sort of the difference there. That they're not, so in areas where there are plantations, it's more common for labor to be hired out from a plantation into an urban center. Not necessarily so for these areas in the North, Philadelphia, New York, and the like. They oftentimes have a greater proportion of enslaved labor than the countryside, right? And so there's not necessarily hiring out to temporary labor in that way. And so, but I think also the continuity, however, is that, you know, you're right that they're building the infrastructure of these cities, right, in ways that we don't think about, right? We think about the fact that, you know, they're desiring, or these slaveholders need labor or want labor for plantations, sure, to produce cash crops, of course. But I mean, the infrastructure of these cities are, you know, it takes someone to actually plow these areas and take out the wilderness and create these roads and buildings and et cetera, right? So in so much we tend to think about, oh, well, the North, they didn't necessarily need slavery, and they clearly, it was extraordinarily influential, right, to build up these cities into what they actually became in ways that we oftentimes do not think about, and I don't think they get the credit they should. I mean, I remember the country was up in arms when Michelle Obama mentioned, you know, that slave labor was used to build the White House, right? But it was true, right? And so this idea that we don't tend to think about cities in that way, in the way that we think about plantations as relying upon enslaved labor. I think in part because the numbers aren't as large, but I think it's important for us to understand, you know, when we think about the how these cities come to be the metropolises that they eventually turn into and are today, right? We need to understand the debt to enslaved labor.
And Michael, I would add, even though that's absolutely right, but to carry the story forward, I mean, convict labor, right? You know, convict labor just takes over where slave labor left off.
Very true.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you, Philip.
Oh, bye, Philip. Yeah, that's a really interesting point about, you know, the slave leasing and renting from the plantation to urban environments in the South. So leads me to the question, so who were kind of the primary slave owners in a place like Philadelphia?
So it ran the gambit. A lot of these are sort of gentlemen, right? Who see it as sort of a status symbol to hold on to their enslaved folks, and they have domestics and they have laborers under them. there are a sizable number of artisans, right, who actually employ enslaved labor. So a lot of the labor, a significant amount of enslaved labor is special. We would qualify as specialized labor, although I think that's problematic as well, right? And so it sort of runs the gambit between that and so there's also an uptick during the 7 Years' War for many of these sort of, we would say, middling people, right? These artisans and the like. And the reason why is because many of the white indentured servants go to war during the 7 Years' War, right? And so they turn more to enslaved labor necessarily so. Yeah, hopefully that gives you a sense of the type of work that they're engaging on into, whether that's domestic, whether that's working on shipbuilding, blacksmithing, right? Producing any number of things, public works, of course, right? As we mentioned, it sort of runs the gambit as well as who's employing them. I think Matthew had a question.
Yeah, I'm curious about your choice to focus on the time period 1680 to 1807. What led you to that particular time period?
Yeah. So I focus the 1680s isn't a hard thing. It's more 1680s. It just didn't look amazing on the cover of the book. But I mean, so the 1680s is really when these cities start to come into being, so to speak, right? They start to formulate into organized entities. Kingston comes a little bit later. It has roots earlier, but it doesn't really come into sort of importance until after its predecessor, Port Royal, suffers an earthquake in the 1690s. But that's sort of, I use the 1680s as a sort of rough spot for us to start to see how these cities started to come into being and understanding. And the reason I think it's really important for the connection between Philadelphia and the Caribbean is because the first shipment of enslaved individuals, enslaved laborers, they come in 1684. They actually come from Barbados. And likely from Bridgetown, right? And so that helps us understand from the very beginning, right? There's this real connection to the Caribbean in ways that we do not think about that are true to the lived realities of enslaved folks, right? Like Jeffrey Brace, who actually starts in Bridgetown, but will eventually be taken up to New England in his story, right? And so, and then I end in 1807, again, sort of rough, but helps us to understand. I want to sort of help us understand that the ending of the Atlantic slave trade is sort of an important point, right? Because it'll help us to understand sort of this shift in where these enslaved folks are coming from, what they're bringing with them, right? How the institution changes, right? Very necessarily so, because there's an end to the Atlantic slave trade as well.
Thank you. Oh, Ethan.
Yeah, I was just wondering, I know it's more towards the tail end of the time period that you cover. I'm just curious, maybe like a place like, especially like Kingston, being in the Caribbean, what was the effect of the Haitian Revolution
Yeah.
kind of on the one, like, I don't know, did it change, like, how did it change slavery, I guess maybe in simplistic terms, in Kingston or the British the British Caribbean?
Yeah, so that is a big question. So there's actually a book by Trevor Bernard that actually looks at this recently. And what historians are increasingly trying to really grapple with is how these slaveholders are reacting, right? As you can imagine, they're terrified once they hear about this massive slave revolt. I mean, it's more complicated than that, of course, in Haiti, but essentially what we can say is that it turns into a large slave revolt, right? And a nation run by people of African descent, right? It terrifies these slaveholders, and so they're extraordinarily vigilant, as you can imagine, right? We can see that there are slave laws that are increasingly geared toward trying to make sure that this doesn't happen in the British Caribbean, that the enslaved population is being watched more so than ever, as well as there is, of course, as you could imagine, there is this apprehension and this let's say reticence to accept refugees from Haiti, right, or from Saint-Domingue, the colony that predated the nation of Haiti, because there are refugees that are coming to spaces like Philadelphia, right? So Philadelphia actually has refugees that come from Saint-Domingue, and there are also laws that are passed in Philadelphia to try to deal with these refugees because there's fear that they will create havoc. But I think you mentioned Kingston, the Caribbean, because I think in British Atlantic more generally, there is this, Gary Nash uses this term in Philadelphia, but I think it's true for much of the British Atlantic. There's a growing Negrophobia, but there's a growing racism, right? Based off of this fear that the Black population is going to rise up. So this helps us understand as well. I think it was, maybe it was you, Ethan, who asked I mentioned, this, the role of or as Matt, I'm sorry, the role of the Quakers. I mentioned this revolutionary moment, right? All the ideals of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, et cetera, in Philadelphia that helped propel the abolitionist movement. Well, in part because of Haiti, that doesn't come to, that moment sort of dies out because there's this growing fear that that African Americans, people of African descent, are going to rise up, that they're not necessarily ready for freedom, right? And so that helps us understand a tightening that comes right after a period of potential, right? A period where it seems like there could be a moment of change. That increasingly tightens after the Haitian Revolution because of white fears of what would happen if there was an end to slavery and there was an end to the oppression of these Black laborers, right? And so Haiti makes a huge difference in the prospects. And the abolitionists, if you look at their writings, they're trying to deal with this throughout the British Atlantic or throughout the Anglo Atlantic. They're trying to explain away Haiti, right? Trying not to let it affect the abolitionist movement, trying to say, this is an aberration. If anything, this should encourage us to free these Black populations more quickly because, the alternative is chaos. I don't know how well that works out, but the vast majority, to answer your question, the larger push is a tightening of the system against people of African descent in the Atlantic as a result of Haiti, due to white fears, essentially.
That's a really interesting way to put it, because I forget who it was now, but one of the stories that Eric called Haiti, Napoleon's Vietnam, right? That he was trying to, suppress this. I mean, so I could see how I would play into this notion of God freedom faster, because if you have this really authoritarian, Saint-Domingue was one of the worst slave societies in the world, right? So if you have this really authoritarian, even by slavery standards, this really authoritarian brutal regime, it's like, this is what happens if you don't end it. So it could cut, but on the other hand, it's also like almost the Denmark face your Nat Turner of the North, right? In terms of how it affects the Northern abolition movement.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, so I think that we can see many of these lessons of history that, I like that that Matt points our attention to. So the cyclical nature of these things, right? In so much that Haiti is an isolated incident, I think we can see the ripple effect, right, through these larger demonstrations of collective Black resistance that affect the system of slavery in very real ways.
I was just thinking about, even going back to the question of continuity and how, specific people were able to maintain some continuity. And I was thinking about, and I'm gonna slaughter this, Sylvie and Doyf's book, I believe it's Servants of Allah, who talked about how enslaved people who had Muslim backgrounds in West Africa were able to maintain some continuity a little bit better because of their literacy rates. Do you know anything about? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, so that's a wonderful question. It's not. I didn't really go deeply into Islam for the book. Because of the way where the population. Well, it's because of the demographics, right? The folks that I'm really, if we think about the Caribbean, they're mostly coming from areas that aren't Muslim. if we look at the spaces where they're originating from. But I think we can think about continuity in some other ways, right, from traditional West African religions, right? Part of one of the chapters where that I sort of look at in the book was trying to understand, right, this cultural continuity, these cultural continuities in a comparative framework between these cities. And I think what we do see is that, at least the argument I make, is that we can see that cultural continuity in Philadelphia, for instance, in ways that are less visible over time, but not any less important, right? And so here we can see the emergence of for example, the first independent Black churches in Philadelphia, right? And their worship practices are very much West African, and they borrow from West African traditions in ways that, you know, white observers note, right? They say that they're worshiping different than, right, even though they have similar, you know, tenets to the religion, right? They're connected to the Episcopal religion, for instance, right? But their worship practices, even mitigated through white gazes or white observers, they're clearly different, right? And so we think about calm response. We can think about, you know, the idea of a spiritual or placing one's entire spirit into worship, not versus sort of the very restrained worship of their white counterparts in the Episcopal religion, right? So we think about St. Thomas's Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, right? The first independent Black church in North America. Even though it's part of that denomination, looks very different. It's because of this continuity of West African traditions, right? And so, so I think we can see through lines there in very real ways. That people usually point out oftentimes for plantations, but we don't necessarily think about that for cities. Yeah,
absolutely. Sorry, I'm thinking so much about my African American religious traditions class I took in my master's program. Anybody?
I was going to jump in. I mean, I think that's a really interesting point, because I mean, I've read a lot about Gullah Geechee culture.
Yeah.
And so it seems to have some parallels, but in a very interesting way, in a very different setting that I wouldn't have expected. So that's I'm glad you're forcing me to think differently about some of these issues.
That's good. I'm glad to hear it. Yeah, I think you're right. We think about, you know, Geechee, Gullah, right? These very, and that's one of the criticisms about Herskovich, right? If we his book, The Myth of the Negro Past. He makes this argument about, you know, the continuity of West African traditions, but one of the criticisms he gets is that from his detractors is that, you know, you're sort of cherry picking, right? You're picking the Gullahs, or you're picking the Geechees, you're picking South America, these plantations in the Caribbean, right? Sort of easy examples to choose, but I think the larger point is that what he's highlighting is true. It just looks very different, right? And the extent to which they would hold on is mitigated, right, based off of their circumstances. But it's there. It's incumbent on us to really peel that back and try to understand those connections. But it requires also us looking at, you know, West African history, pre-colonial West Africa, and what those worship practices look like, and what those traditions look like.
Do you think there's enough awareness of the greater Atlantic just in the US in the general population, or is this an area where there needs to be a broader understanding for Americans today to really see these ties that may not be so obvious to us now?
Yeah, I think we would do well by exposing ourselves. We tend to be American and very American focused, right? But I think that's part of our perspective in our curriculums. But to better understand, right? So right now, for example, I'm actually teaching the Haitian Revolution, I actually just got done teaching the Haitian Revolution in my early African American history course. And one of the things my students were fascinated by, and they kept harping on when we were talking about, you know, Napoleon's the necessity of Napoleon to sell this large swath of land to Jefferson in the United States, and the Louisiana Purchase was very much based off of what he's suffering in Haiti, right? The war cost him, right, money and resources, and so he's sort of desperate. But their reaction was based off of, in their words, they highlighted, right, in school we just learned that, you know, Jefferson was so forward thinking that he was able to sort of hustle Napoleon out of in this deal, right? And so he should be revered, and America is so forward thinking about the future and et cetera, right? And so if we do not take the larger perspective of the Atlantic, right, it allows us to only see part of that story. I mean, I actually end the book with some interviews. I was actually interview a couple of descendants of Jeffrey Brace, which was really cool. And part of what they highlighted, right, is that when they first discovered the narrative of their ancestor, they didn't really have their purview, right, of the Atlantic, this discussion of West Africa, the discussion of the Caribbean in their larger story. They just knew that their family lived in New England, right? And they didn't necessarily they saw themselves as African American, sure, but they didn't see the larger perspective of history, of their own history, right? And so I think we as individuals, as well as Americans, would do well in trying to really broaden our perspective outside of our national borders to help us understand the larger, these larger processes and developments outside of those things.
I just want to end with asking, do you have any favorite anecdotes from your book, or any particular favorite people or stories? Yeah.
So actually there's a chapter on a man named Caesar. So I love some of the actors or folks that I look at in the book, right? Jeffrey Brace, Florence Hall, etc. But there's an enslaved man named Caesar that I read a chapter about. I was fascinated by his story. So he's clearly an enslaved man, but he runs away in Philadelphia right before the Revolution. He's actually from the Caribbean originally, which is really fascinating. The runaway slave advertisement mentions that his slaveholder is afraid he's going to get back to the islands. But what really gripped me was that he runs away, or this ad is actually posted on the 4th of July, and so that's sort of the fascinating part of this. It's a couple of years before the Declaration of Independence, and it's fascinating to me that this man runs away on, at least the ad is posted right on the 4th of July. And I think it speaks to this larger, I think, discussion of freedom and unfreedom during this period, right? In very important ways, because I mean, in so much that we have the Declaration of Independence being written and signed, important and meaningful, sure, but I mean, this enslaved man is actually, he's making a declaration with his feet, is the argument that I'm making, right? He's making this declaration with his actions of actually fleeing, and so it's a fascinating sort of case for us to understand, right, what it means for this man to run away, because it's not something that's a small feat, even in Philadelphia, right, even in a city, but there are some very real, there's so much against him in making this a success. And from what I understand, he actually was successful, but I think ironically enough, his success has to do with the coming of the revolution, right? Philadelphia actually gets occupied, and so the odds of reclaiming him are probably slim, right? And so I think there's so much to say about this one individual in this one case of trying to really uncover what's going on during the period, but also the extent to which enslaved fugitives, right, are able to live, work, exist, and ultimately be successful in that freedom.
Well, thank you. Now I have more questions, but it is 9 o'clock. I believe all of us are East Coasters, so it is 9 o'clock. So I am going to say thank you so much, Michael, for joining us tonight. This was so much fun and so enlightening. And yeah, so very interesting. And thank you for sharing your research with us. And we are very grateful.
Thank you all for having me. Thank you for the wonderful questions. It's been a pleasure.
And with that, join us again in 2 weeks, where again, if I were more prepared, I would know exactly who was coming on. But it's you, Matthew. I knew you were coming up. So where in 2 weeks, we'll have Matthew Hild and Michael Gagnon come on talking about the history of Gwinnett County, Georgia. So join us then, and we will see you next time. Thank you.